Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those dialing in from different parts of the world. Welcome to the Resilience and Disaster Risk Management Week of GPRU's Learning Days, Spring to Learning. As you may already know, in lieu of our Learning Week, we are providing space and time for you to learn at your own pace as we all participate in any of our GSG weeks with technical learning on the latest topics. These scheduled sessions are divided into 6 weeks, and this week we are in the Resilience and DRM week. Our learning catalog highlights over 200 archived technical sessions that were delivered over the past couple of years. In case you missed them, these are recorded and are available to view and to see at your own pace. You can always type GPRU Learning in your browser and to get the latest information and these resources for your learning days. Thank you very much for joining today on this session on operationalizing risk-sensitive land use planning and regulatory reforms, a way to make cities resilient to climate and disaster risk. Thanks to the Resilience Cities program and to the building regulations for Resilience Program Knowledge Silo Record for putting this session on. As you may know, I have 2 hats as a lead DRM Africa and also as a lead for GFDRR Building Regulations for Resilience Program. And I have been also advising GFDRR Zero Resilience Program. So today we would like to show one of the emerging examples of collaboration between GFDRR global programs to better help World Bank teams reduce climate and disaster risk and to see what threads we can pull that will be of most assistance to you. Across our global practice, our task teams are conducting many technical studies, advisories, and projects based on a wide range of approaches and instruments in land use planning, and in order to help develop cities in a sustainable way. So we have a good handle of what the many of these approaches and instruments are, whether it's zoning guidelines, building codes, environmental protection, or a host of other available tools. When implemented well, they can help lower exposure to disasters and reduce risk in a context of growing cities and a changed climate, and make urban services and infrastructure more resilient as well. But the problem, as many of are aware, are the large gaps in capacity, in enforcement, in integrating data, and in harmonizing in overall development and building control processes, policies, and regulations. So we are seeing a need across our task teams for better understand how to study, how to observe, how to advise, and support the implementation of land use planning measures that incorporate the risk present in cities and the way they affect people and assets. In this session, we hope to be able to align our understanding of the benefits and the importance of incorporating risk-sensitive land use planning into our work. We will first hear from Lucas Leshner, Disaster Risk Management Specialist in GPRU Africa, on what we mean by risk-sensitive land use planning and how it looks in practice. Then we are happy to welcome Claudia Andrea Ramirez, Deputy Secretary of Territorial Planning of the City of Bogota, Colombia, who will highlight the case of how Bogota has been handling this process. And then Ebru Genser, Adjunct Associate Professor of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, Department of Columbia University, we will share the case of Istanbul. And then we will conclude with a Q&A session. The speakers will welcome your questions on the materials presented. Please post your questions on the chat during the presentations. We will address them during the Q&A session. At the end of the session, we will share a link to a survey that focuses on technical assistance for risk-sensitive land use planning that will allow you to conduct assessments on this space and mechanisms to make this faster that would otherwise be possible through normal procurement channels. We will not be able to dive too much into this during the session, but we will be very happy to hear about your views through the survey to start. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Keiko Sakura, the moderator of this session.
Thank you so much, Anna. My name is Keiko. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm co-lead for the Building Integration Program together with Anna. And without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague, Lucas Losner, we're going to talk about what we mean by the risk-sensitive land use plan. Go ahead, Lucas.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Keiko. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Okay, I see the presentation is loading. So as Anna and Keiko had mentioned, we'd like to kick you off with a brief introduction about the conceptual principles of risk-sensitive land use planning before we look into the practical examples from our colleagues from Colombia and Turkey. My name is Lucas Löschner. I'm disaster risk management specialist with the World Bank. I work in the East Africa region, mainly with teams in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And of course, this is a region, as most of our countries, which are facing extreme pressing challenges towards developing more risk-informed and risk-sensitive approaches and land use planning. So I'm hoping with this very quick presentation that we can set the scene for today's discussion. And I'm pleased to welcome a lot of colleagues from different regions as well. Next slide, please. So starting off with a very general definition of land use planning. Land use planning is the process undertaken by public authorities to identify, evaluate, and decide on different options for the use of land, including consideration of long-term economic, social, and environmental objectives and implications with different communities and interest groups, and the subsequent formulation and promulgation of plans that describe the permitted or acceptable uses. This definition highlights a few key issues of land use planning. First, it is a public task. It is a public responsibility. So it's mainly public authorities which have to take these decisions. And they identify, evaluate, and decide on different options for the use of land. So what you see on the map on the right is a definition of land use. But this map could look very different if different options had been taken, for instance. And in these long-term definitions of land use, there are different considerations that come into play. And these are very long-term definitions, long-term considerations, because we plan for generations ahead. And so there is a constant process of weighing economic, social, and environmental objectives, and thinking about different implications of these land uses for different communities and interest groups. And subsequently, what we see here is the representation, formulation, and promulgations of plans. So a representation of these land use decisions. Next slide, please. Importantly, what we see, the land use decisions that have been taken, they are actually embedded in a multi-level governance scheme of land use planning, which involves authorities and responsibility at different levels of government, national, regional, local. It involves different legislations and ordinances, different decision-making bodies, and a range of different instruments, which could be binding and non-binding. Next slide, please. Importantly, and this directly relates to risk-sensitive land use planning, of course, that when we take long-term planning decisions, we have to consider that disaster risk is a dynamic concept. There is no such thing as a static risk. Although when decisions are taken, these risks are often assessed for a status quo. But it's important to note that the three key constituents of risk, namely hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, they increase or decrease over time, and with that, the level of disaster risk. With regards to hazard change, of course, climate-related influences, climate change is changing the intensity and frequency of hazards, but also human actions, for instance, related to deforestations or changes in river morphology, can change the hazard that we're planning for. Secondly, and this directly relates to risk-sensitive is the change in exposure. Exposure is the people and assets that are subject to disaster impacts. And especially in the case of the Africa region, with a very high dynamic in population and settlement growth. This marks a key driver of risk. And a key responsibility and objective of risk-sensitive land use planning is actually to mitigate and prevent the further encroachment of settlements into hazard prone areas. And third, vulnerability. So the susceptibility of people and assets to damage. And here, building regulations, but also changing socioeconomic conditions can increase, but also decrease the vulnerability. Next slide, please. So essentially, risk-sensitive land use planning is an integral part of disaster risk management, whereby decisions on land use and urban development are informed by the hazard and risk information with the aim to reduce current, but also expected future impacts of disasters. So risk-sensitive land use planning, it is informed by good and reliable hazard and risk information. This is a key challenge, as we will see also from the examples from practice. And importantly, as land use planning in general, it is a forward-looking exercise. We try to look ahead, we try to anticipate changes in exposure, changes in hazard, and changes in vulnerability. And so there's three key issues that such planning decisions therefore rely on. One is the information, hazard exposure, vulnerability. Second is that there is a policy or regulatory framework in place for these land use planning decisions to be taken. And third, that there is a bucket of land use management and planning instruments that we can rely on. Next slide, please. This slide also illustrates the integral component of land use planning for disaster risk management. I won't go through all of these pillars in detail, but you see here that risk-sensitive land use planning is essentially rooted in risk reduction, and it often complements structural measures of risk reduction. Land use planning, as other measures, is of course a non-structural measures, and it is often a measure which is fairly cost efficient, but it is very difficult to enforce, and it is something which so far has received fairly little attention. It is something that is not as visible as structural measures. Next slide, please. And finally, this is a diagram which shows how risks can be brought down. And we see here that regulating land use planning is most effective when addressing pathways. And we see here different instruments, so setbacks, for instance, building restrictions and flood proofing in place. So it is part of a cascade of measures that can be taken to reduce disaster, or in this case, flood risk. Next slide. Finally, and I won't go into too much detail here, but what's critical is that risk-sensitive land use planning, it really cuts across sectors. So land use planning per se is not a defined sector. It is really an integrated approach which touches upon different related policy sectors. And we see here in the table, for instance, that risk-sensitive land use planning has a strong relevance for water management, agriculture and forestry, environmental protection, transportation infrastructure, and recreation and tourism. For instance, for water management, through risk-sensitive land use planning, we can demarcate flood runoff and retention areas. We can define flood hazard zones, but also it is critical that there's close coordination between water management authorities and engineers. Next slide, please. We saw earlier one of the graphics that at the heart of risk-sensitive land use planning is reliable hazard and risk information. And this, as we've seen, is a key challenge. In many countries, there's a limited understanding of the underlying hazards. There's a limited understanding of the exposure, especially of the changes in exposure. And of course, relatedly also to the vulnerability and how this translates into potential physical damage. But this information is critical when it comes to developing suitable measures and strategies to reduce current and future risk. Next slide. And sorry, I need to speed up a bit. I see we have just a few minutes left. So this figure just illustrates that within a city and urban setting, there are, of course, multiple hazard exposures and different vulnerabilities. And we see here on the left, informal settlements which are exposed to flooding, whereas on steep slopes, buildings may be exposed to landslides. And so these overlapping hazard exposure and vulnerabilities are additional challenge for risk-sensitive land use planning. Next slide. This slide shows that there is a range of tools and instruments that we can use for risk-sensitive land use planning. At the nexus of risk-sensitive land use planning are regulatory tools, so zoning plans and ordinances, development controls and restrictions which limit the usage and occupation and density of uses, but also building codes to make sure that building structures are better able to withstand shocks. However, in contexts where there's limited enforcement of regulatory measures, we may have to use economic, financials, and behavioral instruments to reach the intended objectives. Next slide. Okay, I think we can, next slide. Okay, yeah, and just finally, I'm sorry I had to rush through in the end, but I wanted to highlight that our team is finalizing a guidance note on risk-sensitive land use planning. And with this guidance note, we really aim to develop an actionable and practice-oriented guideline, which aims to enhance disaster risk reduction through risk-sensitive approaches in land use planning. So we present different approaches. And while this guidance note really focuses on spatial planning as the pivotal sector for risk-sensitive land use planning, we do also acknowledge the sector relations with other policy domains. And we showcase a set of instruments that may be leveraged to attain these objectives. So we hope to launch this guidance note soon, and we will have a follow-up meeting where we'll be happy to discuss these approaches. So thank you so much. Back over to you, Keiko. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. If you have any question, please pose your question to the chat function. So now I would like to invite the next speaker, Ms. Claudia Andrea Ramirez Motila, Deputy Secretary of the Territorial Planning, City of Bogota, Colombia. She's an economist, and then as an economist, Ms. Motila has held important roles at the government of Bogota over the years to improve the physical planning, leveraging her knowledge in public policy, urban and regional economics, and territorial development, and also housing for vulnerable population. She held many important roles, including Director of Macro Studies in the Bogota Planning Secretariat, Senior Economics in the National Planning Department, and also Deputy Secretary of Planning and Policy in Bogota Habitat Secretariat. She also dedicated her effort in formulation, monitoring, and evaluation of public policies on forced displacement and other victims of violence, and urban economy and land use planning, habitat, and housing. So we are very great to hear from you, Claudia. So Claudia will speak in Spanish. So if you need an English translation, please go to the interpretation tab below of your screen and choose the English channel. Over to you, Ms. Claudia. Thank you.
Hola, bueno, muchas gracias por el espacio. Los saludo a todos de manera muy especial. Me siento muy complacida de estar con ustedes aquí, contarles la experiencia de Bogotá frente a su plan de ordenamiento territorial y particularmente sobre la incorporación de la gestión del riesgo en este instrumento tan importante para la ciudad, que es un plan a largo plazo, a 14 años, donde se incorporan una serie de objetivos este tema de la gestión del riesgo cobra una importancia bastante fundamental. Empiezo por contarles que el pasado mes de diciembre Bogotá adopta su nuevo plan de ordenamiento territorial y dos elementos fundamentales que hacen parte de este plan de ordenamiento son dos consideraciones sustanciales. Uno es precisamente este tema, que es todo lo que es relacionado al cambio climático y la necesidad de incorporar precisamente esta gestión del riesgo, que es fundamental, es una nueva concepción y la necesidad de incorporar en nuestro plan este tema era fundamental. Y dos, los efectos que pues ha traído consigo la pandemia y los nuevos retos también en términos económicos y en todos los componentes pues que también hacen parte de este plan de ordenamiento territorial. Entonces estos fueron los dos eventos más importantes y pues me voy a enfocar sobre ese primero y cómo incorporamos dentro de nuestro plan este tema. Ahora, Bogotá lleva una trayectoria, ya lleva mucho tiempo precisamente incorporando este tema y hay una política específica y un término de acciones, pero particularmente este plan de ordenamiento territorial incorpora muy fuerte este elemento. No puedo iniciar sin darles un contexto sobre estos 7 objetivos, que son los 7 objetivos de este plan de ordenamiento territorial, que les decía son objetivos a largo plazo, que tiene como primera medida es proteger la estructura ecológica principal y todo lo que digamos son los paisajes alrededor de Bogotá. Y esto es súper importante porque todos los elementos de importancia ambiental entran a ser como el primer elemento ordenador del territorio en Bogotá. Y eso es un primer objetivo a largo plazo que tiene que ver incluso también con todo este enfoque de mitigación de desastres y digamos también haciéndole frente a los retos del cambio climático. Pero aparte de esto y de reconocer los elementos, está este segundo objetivo que es fundamental dentro del plan de ordenamiento territorial y es incrementar la resiliencia precisamente para poder mitigar y hacer frente pues, a los desafíos que nos pone este cambio climático. Es un objetivo de largo plazo que está dentro de nuestro plan y que es transversal al resto de objetivos. El tercer objetivo es mejorar el ambiente urbano y rural de todos nuestros asentamientos, de toda nuestra ocupación territorial, que también tienen que ver con este objetivo. Revitalizar la ciudad, promover el dinamismo, la activación económica y la creación de empleos, dado pues el otro reto que les contaba. Reducir las inigualdades y los desequilibrios y también promover el desarrollo rural de manera sostenible. Entonces, si ustedes ven, hay un segundo objetivo a largo plazo fundamental y que es transversal al resto de objetivos. Siguiente, por favor. Entonces, dando este contexto, digamos, y un poco para hablar también ya del alcance y cómo estamos nosotros enfrentando estos eventos, pues incluso esta es una de las imágenes que también mostraba ahorita Lucas, que conceptualmente es nuestro también, digamos, enfoque general y aproximación a este tema, y es que el cambio climático, la variabilidad climática y el riesgo de desastre, pues está totalmente relacionado, y pues digamos, es una realidad que el cambio climático está incrementando su frecuencia, su intensidad, la cantidad de eventos climáticos pues son una realidad, los efectos también que está teniendo sobre la población y sobre las ocupaciones son importantes, entonces es una realidad que tenemos que tener en cuenta en nuestro proceso de planificación y en la necesidad de manejar, primero de prevenir y de mitigar esos efectos y también de una u otra manera tener las medidas para poder controvertir cuando pasa algún tipo de desastre. Entonces, este es como nuestro contexto conceptual y nuestra aproximación a lo que se incorporó dentro de nuestro plan de ordenamiento territorial. Siguiente, por favor. Entonces, en esta medida, dentro de nuestro plan, como les decía, hay un objetivo específico que es este. Es incrementar la capacidad de resiliencia del territorio frente a la ocurrencia de los desastres derivados de la variabilidad y del cambio climático. O sea, eso es, y ahí en nuestro plan tenemos programas y proyectos asociados específicamente a obtener este objetivo. Los programas y proyectos que se concretan, pero también en general toda la norma urbana, la norma rural, todas las disposiciones están enfocados precisamente a incrementar esta capacidad de resiliencia del territorio. Entonces, por favor, siguiente. En este sentido, pues quiero contarles que nosotros fuimos de las primeras ciudades en Latinoamérica al declarar la emergencia del cambio climático. Y obviamente nuestro plan de ordenamiento territorial frente a esta realidad, pues tiene varias acciones, incluso concretas y particulares, para mitigar pues todo lo que tiene que ver con los gases con efecto invernadero, reducir la vulnerabilidad de los habitantes, las infraestructuras, los ecosistemas, que digamos es un foco fundamental con nuestras medidas, y además también pues aprovechar y hacerle frente con las oportunidades que tenemos para precisamente generar condiciones que mitiguen estos eventos. Entonces, esto digamos como también para reiterar que sí estamos incorporando la gestión del riesgo en nuestro plan, pero es un tema que incluso Bogotá ya viene trabajando desde varios años, reconociendo esta emergencia y también tomando medidas para mitigar, prevenir y actuar frente a la ocurrencia de desastres. Siguiente, por favor. Y en este sentido, en nuestro plan de ordenamiento territorial hemos incluido varias estrategias como diferentes formas para manejar precisamente o para gestionar este riesgo y incorporando instrumentos, como lo decía ahorita también Lucas, que es como lo importante dentro de estas estrategias, es tener instrumentos concretos que permiten precisamente la gestión de este riesgo. Acá ustedes ven 4 que son fundamentales dentro de nuestro plan. Primero es pues determinar o incluir disposiciones para precisamente generar condiciones adecuadas de localización y construcción para, digamos, hacer que estas edificaciones estén sin peligro y además sean resistentes. Entonces, eso permite, pues, obviamente mitigar el riesgo y generar las condiciones para adecuada localización y sobre todo para que la población esté totalmente localizada y totalmente bien localizada. Y por eso nuestro instrumento de planeación territorial, pues, establece esas condiciones precisamente para reducir ese riesgo existente. Entonces, una primera estrategia es que desde la misma normatividad y el mismo reconocimiento de este tipo de riesgos, pues hay unas condiciones de localización particular para nuestras infraestructuras y para la población. Esa es como una primera estrategia. Una segunda estrategia, y es pues para adaptarnos a la capacidad y tener corresponsabilidad frente al tema de la gestión del riesgo, es cada vez, y eso también lo mencionaba Lucas en su exposición, es la necesidad de tener análisis, conocimiento mucho más profundo, investigación sobre el tipo de riesgo y cómo mitigar o cómo manejar el riesgo que está en el territorio. Y para esto es necesario tener medidas de evaluación, de monitoreo, de estar en constante nivel técnico de conocer estos peligros y de conocer cómo mitigar el riesgo. Y eso es un elemento también fundamental y estratégico, que si bien nuestro plan de ordenamiento hace un análisis profundo sobre los tipos de amenazas, las condiciones de amenaza, la condición de riesgo, hay unos estudios básicos que se incorporan, es fundamental precisamente para poder garantizar que podamos hacer esta gestión del riesgo, que hayan unos estudios más de detalle frente a estos tipos de riesgo y ver cómo manejarlos, y esto hace parte de la segunda estrategia fundamental. La tercera es que es necesario fortalecer la capacidad de adaptarnos al cambio climático, y esto es más con un enfoque desde las comunidades, de nuestros ecosistemas, digamos, para ver que al proteger precisamente nuestros elementos ambientales, al promover acciones para reconformar nuestros ecosistemas y mantener la importancia y la conservación ambiental, y también proteger las comunidades y que las comunidades sean conscientes de este elemento, hacemos que cada vez seamos más resilientes y nos adaptemos a esta nueva situación. y eso es una tercera estrategia fundamental. Y una cuarta estrategia que está totalmente relacionada con determinaciones dentro de nuestro mismo plan sobre temas de movilidad, sobre temas de espacio público, sobre tema del tipo de construcciones y edificaciones que requerimos para nuestra ciudad, es precisamente todo está enfocado al bajo desarrollo y a las emisiones de carbón, pues totalmente controladas y cada vez mínimas en la ciudad, y esto tiene que ver mucho con las disposiciones generales, sobre todo en términos de movilidad. Entonces, ustedes ven, son 4 estrategias que están a lo largo de nuestro plan. Uno, asociado a la localización, ubicación pues, de los asentamientos. Otro es hacia el conocimiento del riesgo. Otro es precisamente hacia la misma preservación ambiental y cómo las comunidades se involucran en esto. Y lo otro son las medidas precisamente para lograr disminuir las emisiones de carbono. Entonces son 4 estrategias que incluimos dentro del plan de ordenamiento territorial. Siguiente, por favor. Y hay diferentes medidas precisamente que incorporamos dentro de nuestro plan para la adaptación y mitigación del cambio climático. Entonces ustedes aquí ven en esta diapositiva diferentes medidas que en parte, digamos, si la diapositiva anterior eran las estrategias generales, acá ya son medidas específicas que incluimos dentro del plan. Entonces lo primero, y que ya les contaba, era la conservación de nuestro ecosistema. Este plan tiene como principio fundamental organizarnos en torno a nuestros elementos ambientales. Eso es un principio fundamental. O sea, es como la primera base de todo el plan, el reconocimiento de nuestros cuerpos hídricos, la protección de nuestros ecosistemas, de nuestra sabana, del río Bogotá, digamos, es un elemento fundamental. Todos los ecosistemas alrededor, el páramo de Sumapaz, los cerros orientales, la reserva ambiental que queda al norte de la Thomas van der Hamen. Hay una cantidad de elementos que hace que pues, nos enfoquemos a la conservación de los ecosistemas, que es un primer elemento como medida para enfrentar el cambio climático. Lo siguiente, les decía, todo el tema de la movilidad enfocada hacia disminuir totalmente las emisiones de carbono. Eso es un elemento transversal de todas las disposiciones sobre la movilidad, tanto del transporte público como, digamos, toda la incorporación de las energías renovables, precisamente para alcanzar esos objetivos. Bueno, todo el tema de la gestión también sobre el recurso del agua, lo que les decía, los cuerpos hídricos para nosotros son fundamentales, la recuperación de los humedales y la preservación de los humedales y el río Bogotá. Una ciudad además con baja emisión de carbono, no solamente en tema de movilidad, sino en todas sus infraestructuras. Hay un elemento fundamental dentro de nuestro plan y es la incorporación del manejo incluso de los residuos. Entonces también todas las medidas que se puedan generar frente a eso. Este plan tiene un nombre y es Bogotá Reverdece, o sea que hay una estrategia muy fuerte de reverdecimiento y esto también hace parte precisamente para enfrentar pues todos los riesgos que pueden demandarse de este evento de cambio climático. Construcción sostenible, hay toda una política que adopta nuestro plan sobre la necesidad de tener ecourbanismo y construcción sostenible. E incluso en este momento, derivado de esa política, estamos en construcción de una reglamentación enfocada hacia tener incentivos para que las edificaciones, o sea que desde el mismo sector privado, constructores, promotores, incorporen en sus infraestructuras y en su negocio este tema de la construcción sostenible a través de incentivos y que esto permita el desarrollo también de la ciudad de esta manera. Como les decía, también hay todo un enfoque sobre pues, alcanzar una eficiencia y una infraestructura sobre el manejo de la energía con fuentes no convencionales que aporten precisamente en generar estos equilibrios y, bueno, toda la reducción del riesgo asociado al cambio climático, que es incluso ya muy particular del manejo de las comunidades que pues se encuentran en riesgo. Entonces, estas son toda la cantidad de medidas que están ya incorporadas y que hacen parte precisamente de ese objetivo de largo plazo que tiene nuestro plan. Siguiente. Entonces ya a partir de todos estos elementos, pues digamos que nuestro plan de ordenamiento territorial, pues lo primero que hace, pues es reconocer, y como les decía, como una de las estrategias, es reconocer toda la cantidad de amenazas y los impactos que puede tener estas amenazas sobre nuestro ordenamiento, sobre la ocupación de nuestro territorio, y a partir de eso categorizarla y pues generar diferentes escenarios para poder tener los tipos de manejo frente a frente a los riesgos de desastre que puede tener, pues que podemos enfrentar en Bogotá. En Bogotá, pues tenemos desde deslizamientos hasta inundaciones, diferentes tipos de inundaciones, tenemos también riesgo de incendios forestales, también riesgos sísmicos, riesgos de tecnología, que pues son todos los tipos de peligros que hemos podido identificar en Bogotá y que pues son fundamentales pues para determinar su modelo de ocupación. Aquí antes de pasar, nosotros pues Colombia en general tiene también una reglamentación nacional y unos lineamientos particulares sobre cada uno de estos tipos de peligro y pues como lo decía ahora incluso Lucas, esto también tiene una regulación multinivel, esto es una escala totalmente local, cada vez a detalle, pero pues obviamente tenemos un marco general que es dado por la regulación nacional y que es manejada y ya incorporada dentro de la gestión como tal en este tipo de instrumentos que pues digamos que dentro de los más importantes está el plan de ordenamiento territorial. Entonces cada uno de estos tipos de amenazas, estos tipos de peligro pues están totalmente caracterizados y son los que hacen parte del análisis para poder establecer ese modelo de ocupación. Entonces si seguimos, vamos a ver unos mapas. Siguiente, porfa. Entonces, esto, lo primero, un primer nivel es identificar esas amenazas y zonificarlas, digamos, en el territorio, dónde están esas amenazas. Pero luego, digamos que lo importante es hacer esta categorización de esos peligros, o sea, saber si están en alto, si están en medio, si están en bajo, para poder, digamos, identificar el tipo de medidas. Y hay dos tipos de condiciones que nosotros hemos denominado. Uno son las condiciones de amenaza, que es en esos territorios sin ocupar todavía, podemos establecer si es alta, media o baja, qué tipo de acciones de mitigación se tendrían que hacer para poder contrarrestar ese nivel de amenaza. Ahora, para eso es necesario siempre hacer unos estudios de detalle para precisamente determinar bajo estos niveles cuáles son las medidas de mitigación. Eso llama un estudio de detalle. Si ustedes ven, este es el mapa de Bogotá. Y digamos que pues para cada uno de los peligros, tanto de deslizamiento como de inundaciones, como por ejemplo de incendios forestales, pues está entonces categorizado ese tipo de amenazas. Entonces, una es la condición de amenaza y como les decía, ya la necesidad de establecer las medidas en específico para poder, digamos que son territorios seguramente sin ocupar, para poder establecer qué tipo de medidas para mitigar esos impactos se deben hacer. Y otra cosa es cuando ya analizamos las condiciones de riesgo, que es ya identificando incluso esos territorios que ya están ocupados incluso por población, asentamientos humanos informales, infraestructuras, de hecho, que están ya en el territorio y es necesario ver qué tipo de condición de riesgo para ver si ya sea alto, medio o bajo, sobre todo cuando es alto, si es mitigable o no es mitigable. Que ahí es cuando viene otra parte de la historia y es qué hacer. Digamos, una cosa es, claro, tener todo este conocimiento, zonificar las amenazas, ver las condiciones de la amenaza, pero ya al ver la condición de riesgo cuando hablamos de la población y sobre todo condición de riesgo alto, es ver qué tipo de medidas entonces toca hacer en ese sentido, que por lo general cuando es no mitigable y está en condición de amenaza alta, pues lo que continúa.
Claudia, I'm so sorry. I think, yeah, we need to move on a little bit. We only have 20 minutes left and then we have one more speaker. So if you don't mind, yeah, could you just, I'm just moving to the, last slide. Yeah.
Sí, claro. No, 3 ideas fundamentales, si quieres, es Entonces, digamos que eso es lo que sigue después y viene todo un proceso o un enfoque también ya de reasentamiento de estas asentaciones informales, precisamente cuando ya tenemos el conocimiento de que si hay una condición de amenaza alta y hay población asentada, pues se tiene que enfrentar precisamente también a esa situación. Y lecciones aprendidas, pues tenemos que continuar fortaleciendo nuestra capacidad institucional frente a los desastres y, digamos, el manejo de estos riesgos. El reconocimiento además, o sea, o incorporarlo en nuestro plan desde tanto lo territorio urbano como rural, y en todo caso es necesario pues tener recursos económicos para precisamente hacer esta gestión del riesgo. Lo único para finalizar es que si es necesario, nosotros tenemos un programa y un subprograma específico que está a cargo de la Autoridad de Riesgos en Bogotá, que es el instituto que se llama el IDIGER. Es una autoridad especializada en este tema que hace toda esa gestión y es el que permite, digamos, aprobar o tener una lupa fundamental en este tema, y a esto cierro que es, digamos, como esa capacidad instalada institucional que es necesaria para hacer esta gestión de riesgo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Claudia. I'm so sorry to cut you in the middle. So now I would like to move on to the next speaker. Yeah, so our next speaker is Ebru Ganser. She's an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University, and she has been a practitioner as a planner, and she worked on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and also urban development and design project in Southeastern Europe, Turkey, Latin America, and Caribbean region. And she also served as very many important roles to contribute to the global dialogue. And she recently joined as a senior consultant for the City Resilience Program. So we would have more opportunity to hear from her in the future. So over to you, Ebru. I'm just switching the PowerPoint.
Thank you very much, Keiko, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to present at this learning session. Today, I would like to present Istanbul as a case study to show how strategic risk-based planning can be translated into implementation at the local level. And I think this makes for an interesting case because as more cities are now urged to develop their DRR-based strategies and plans, especially as a target of the Sendai framework, but many also struggle with this process and turning these strategies into action on the ground. So I want to first start by explaining how DRR-based DRR-based planning strategies were developed in Istanbul, and then talk about the translation of these strategies into implementation instruments at the local level, and then highlight 4 of these instruments. Next, please. First, I want to do a brief overview of the context, and I'm sure many of you already know about this case, and especially because the World Bank had a big project support via the seismic risk mitigation project in Turkey. But to briefly recap, Istanbul is located on the North Anatolian Fault, which is a strike strip fault, which is very similar to San Andreas in California. In late 1999, 2 earthquakes to the southeast of Istanbul occurred on this fault, which is the industrial heartland of Turkey. So in addition to massive losses and injuries, it also caused a big economic loss for the country. Further, due to the nature of this strike strip fault, energy has now moved directly into the south of Istanbul in the Marmara Sea, increasing the direct risk for the city, which was projected with the hazard assessments. Next. The Marmara earthquakes brought a paradigm change in Turkey in terms of earthquake risk management and also for risk-sensitive land use planning. New regulations mandated that local governments now have to undertake risk analysis and approved microzonation to be able to develop land use plans. So this led to the development of the Istanbul Earthquake Master Plan by the Metropolitan Municipality of Istanbul and 4 other 4 universities. The Earthquake Master Plan is a comprehensive document that provides strategies for risk-sensitive urban development and also legal, institutional, and financial frameworks for implementation. So as the previous presenter showed, it starts with hazard and risk assessments, such as these ones, which are then integrated into the planning studies to develop risk-based strategies for development. Next. So risk-based planning studies examine the characteristics of the urban environment, such as population dynamics, land use, ownership, industry, urban functions, and so forth, and analyzes the problems of the area, and then also finds opportunities for planning and development. So I want to show you 2 of these type of studies. For instance, now if we look at building stock and housing development, building stock is the biggest challenge for risk reduction in Istanbul. Here on the left, you can see this map, the pink and red areas were informally developed. Indeed, as of the time of analysis, 80% of the building stock in Istanbul did not have necessary building permits. They were either informally developed with very low quality construction, or even the ones that were developed in planned areas were later modified without appropriate construction controls. But as I said, in addition to finding these challenges, we also have to find opportunities for planning and development. Here, for instance, some of these unplanned areas in pink shades also have very low densities, or they are located in high land value areas, close to the transportation nodes, or close to nature reserves, presenting opportunities for development, increasing densities, and using the land as a land value as a financial instrument for urban regeneration. Next. Here is another study. Now looking at industry. There are again multiple challenges with industry areas. Excuse me. Some larger scale industry areas are located in mid to high risk earthquake zones, which may lead to cascading disasters such as with explosions or fires. And some industries in the periphery are also located, or they are encroaching nature reserve areas, such as water basins or forest areas, which create problems for the environment. In addition to the large-scale industry, there are also many examples of small industry areas that are nestled within the urban areas, urban settlements. They also create different type of potential hazards, such as pollution and fires. But again, here are the challenges, but again, we need to think about opportunities. For instance, if we take away these small industries, remove these small industries from these urban settlements, it will not only reduce disaster risk, but it will also create opportunities for urban ignition, redevelopment in these areas. Next. The concluding risk-based strategies for planning is an analysis of these type of several different urban functions and dynamics, which are superimposed on risk assessments, and then the development of potential instruments for their implementation. In this strategic earthquake mitigation plan, 5 planning operations were found as strategies, and they were prioritized. Here, the first priority in planning, just like in Colombia, was to ensure that nature resources of the city, such as water basins and forest areas, are protected, which also means from the planning point of view that the microform stays the same, and that ensuring that the development does not stay within natural thresholds. Second priority that was found as a result of these risk-based planning studies is to ensure that to relocate settlements from hazardous areas. To go with that, the third priority is found to evacuate high-risk areas within the city, reducing their density, which will then help regeneration with a multiplier effect, and then moved these populations to the less dense reserve areas. And fourth priority is decentralizing growth with the introduction of functions of these industry, technoparks, university, together with compact settlements, self-sufficient compact settlements. So this will not only help reducing urban risk, this will not only help reduce disaster risk, but also help with other urban functions in Istanbul, such as with traffic congestion between the two bridges, ensuring that not all the urban functions are located only in one part of the city. And this is really where the larger scale investment opportunities come in the creation of these new urban settlements, developments, but also ensuring that these urban developments are connected with transportation access, such as rapid transit lines, improved railway lines, and highways. Next. So again, this was a strategic DRR-based plan. A strategic plan outlines the vision for the city and the development objectives, and then it scales down on a land use plan, as Lucas showed, with a detailed framework and development parameters and measures such as zoning and development controls. So then, how do these strategic planning priorities translated into implementation in Istanbul? In Istanbul's case, while some of these instruments first started being used in an ad hoc manner in the city, the national government found that the proposed urban reignition and the transformation instrument is an important development opportunity, not only for risk reduction, but also for economic regeneration. So the urban transformation law was enacted. It was institutionalized at the national level, and using this instrument of urban transformation, urban regeneration throughout Turkey for all earthquake-prone cities. So being also backed by the national government, the city then decided to develop this instrument as an urban transformation master plan to be further used in the city in a cohesive manner, and also to move solely from earthquake risk reduction to a more integrated sustainable development approach, integrating also the climate consideration while doing urban regeneration. Here on the right, you can see the hierarchy of planning from project development to the sub-regional territorial plan. Next. So at this moment in Istanbul, two simultaneous planning operations are taking place. One is the traditional planning, risk-based planning approach, which Lucas has shown, which is used mostly in low-risk urban areas with less problems in terms of urban functions. Here, the majority of risk-based planning operations are using two main instruments of retrofitting or building-based regeneration, redevelopment, which are based on micro-zoning studies that are done with borehole studies. Next. The second planning approach that's being used is mostly taking place in these unplanned areas or areas that are with high risk and high problem urban areas. So all districts in Istanbul, all local districts, 39 of them now have urban transformation master plans, which finds the most suitable project area using several different parameters that are ranging from earthquake risk to cultural heritage, ownership, land value, and others. And you can see, for instance, in this district, how different factors are being calculated to find the most optimal project area. Two instruments that are being used are relocation or urban redevelopment. Excuse me. I will now, excuse me. I will now talk briefly about these four instruments, and apologies for my voice. And where it is beneficial to apply these four specific instruments. First, now let's looking at retrofitting. Retrofitting was the first instrument that was used for risk reduction right after the earthquake. My colleagues at Columbia University's civil engineering department at that time made a study to calculate the cost benefits of using different models of retrofitting and how they react in a scenario earthquake in Istanbul. The study found out that even the cost of the best option of retrofitting, which is the full shear wall, which works best against the earthquake, even that model was only the half value of the rebuilding cost in this typical apartment building in a high land value neighborhood. Since retrofitting is a very burdensome process for the residents, it's essential to analyze its cost benefits to rebuilding, especially based on the number of stories allowed in that development zone, and also the cost of the land value. Next. The second instrument that's widely being used is the low risk and in low risk and low problematic urban areas is building-based redevelopment, which is also being supported by this urban transformation law. This process benefits from changes to development parameters, which allow for increases to number of floors in low risk areas. The process starts with the demand from the majority of residents in an apartment building. They can reach out to the municipality to inspect whether their building can withstand an earthquake. If the building is found risky and the residents have an agreement with the private contractor, then the building needs to be demolished and rebuilt within a certain period of time. And during this period, the residents receive rental assistance from the government or the private contractor. And this process becomes a win-win for both the residents and the contractors because the residents move into new housing, which are also earthquake resilient, and the contractors then receive the surplus floors to sell at market value. And in Istanbul, thousands of building stock have already been replaced using this instrument. Next. Now going into this third instrument of planned relocation, reserve areas in the periphery, such as this military area that I'm showing on the left, is used to relocate population from high risk and high problem areas, like from this building, which cannot be rehabilitated using the previous two instruments that I have shown you. Next. So in this model, the reserve area is built as a new self-sufficient development with essential urban amenities and transportation connections. Here in this case, the municipality is building 200,000 housing units, allocating 45,000 of them for the low-income residents who will be relocated at cost value with little to no interest rates, and then the remaining units are mostly sold at market value. This current project is ongoing, and it also aims to build a smart city with the largest city park in the world. But it is important, I would like to emphasize here that it's very important that to understand that planned relocation is a very controversial instrument. It requires utmost consideration of the relocated populations and needs their participation from the very start of the project. It requires a complicated negotiation and the consideration of social life, housing, work, education access, social teams, and other engagements. But it is currently being used in Istanbul. Next. And the final tool that's being used is local redevelopment ignition areas, which aims to not only increase earthquake-resistant building stock, but also to bring urban amenities and ignite urban dynamics. So in this specific project, the municipality has demolished an old jail complex in the city, opening that land for development. And it could be other land, like such as the small industries that I have shown you before, or other vacant land that are found. And this process is producing new development in this vacant land, and then transferring population from the existing development, which is shown here in orange shade, and thus also releasing that area for a future redevelopment site. And many city neighborhoods in Istanbul are currently being redeveloped using this strategy. Next.
Very sorry, I think people started to move to another meeting. So maybe can we move to the final slide?
Yes, it is the last one anyway. So that was the last slide anyway. I just wanted to say that this was a successful urban transformation model because residents not have to move far from their neighborhoods, and they move into new housing units that were both earthquake resistant, but also it was an integrated risk-based planning approach that also included mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And so we do not have time. I'll just leave you with the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ebru. This was very interesting example, which is already ahead of the implementation stage. So thank you so much. I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Stephen Levini, who's going to close the session and also talk a little bit about how our program will continue to work on this topic. Over to you, Stephen.
Hi, thanks everyone who stayed a bit over time. So just to highlight, one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on risk-sensitive land use planning is because we've noticed quite a bit of demand from teams around GPRL and the bank in this area. We've done quite a bit with the City Resilience Program, which is a global program at GFDRR on several different areas related to disaster risk reduction, particularly in the urban space. And this is something that's continually come up as an area where teams want more information, more support. So what we're asking of you now is, if you look at the chat, Keiko has just posted a quick survey where this will take 5 minutes maximum. We're trying to just get a better sense of what the needs are, what the demand is in the space, so that at a programmatic level, we can work to try to bring tools to task teams that can be of use. So if you could please click on the link and fill out the form, that would be very helpful. We'll share the link via email as well. So if you have to drop quickly for another call, that's fine too. So with that, I think we should conclude, as we're already over time. If there are any questions that haven't been answered, or if anything comes up, please do feel free to reach out to the team on the call here. We're more than happy to connect you with the speakers and discuss next steps along risk-sensitive land use planning in the context of your projects as well. So with that, thank you so much for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, Ebru, for taking your time. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Great
Luca.
presentation. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Ebru.
Thanks, Lucas. Nice
Thank you,
meeting you again.
Keiko.
Bye.
Thanks, Anna.